Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time of day you are listening to this. Welcome to another episode of Unresolved Textual Tension. It is just I, Katie, and William today. And I know I have been gone for a hot second. Whether or not that actually conveys through the YouTube videos, who knows? I'm not sure.
So the book we're doing today is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. And this is actually the first Stephen King book I've read. Katie, you have read a couple, right? But not finished them?
Not really. Like, honestly, I've skimmed through them because I wanted to see if it looked interesting. And I've always thought, oh, wow, I like the sound of it, you know? Like, for example, the Dark, it's called The Dark Tower, isn't it?
Yeah, the Dark Tower series.
So I started like literally the first 5 pages of that and I skimmed a couple other ones, but I never truly like sat in it and read it. So this is technically, honestly, also my first Stephen King novel that I'm actually reading. So this will be very fun, I think. It's because I have no background really with him, and with you not, I think we'll have honestly a very clean slate for the critique.
I think so as well. And my general impression of this book is that I am now a King stan. I understand the hype. And I think because this was my first King book, I enjoyed it a little bit more than I would if this wasn't my first Stephen King book, because I was really impressed by his writing, but this book has some major pacing issues in the middle and the back half. And I don't feel like I was really, well, I'll have to talk more about my views with literature and horror, but I was just like, there were parts of this book that didn't work, but there were also parts that I thought worked really well.
Yeah, William and I are on the same page. I don't know if we're on the exact same line on the same page, but we are on the same page because one thing I said as soon as I finished it, I said to my husband, it's very abrupt how like the downhill slope of the second half of the story just feels, it feels off. It doesn't feel... It feels a little off. I don't know. I don't know exactly why because I literally finished it 30 minutes ago. But that being said, it feels strange. And I would say, like, I don't know that it's pacing because my background in horror, I mean, besides the fact that I'm obsessed with it, and that's like 95% of the stuff I read / watch, beyond the podcast, of course. But also, like, I minored in film for a while, and I took a class on horror films, and so a lot of the analysis parts of it have been really fun. If you ever are interested in reading a really great book, Skin Shows is a great book. Her Body Himself is also a great book. But that being said, I think, like, when horror speeds up and it cuts off and starts getting rid of details, almost like PTSD, right? Like, you start losing the details, you start just getting the cuts. I think that works, but maybe, like, he tried to do that here, but the thing is he keeps elongating certain things psychologically with some of the characters, and it feels like dead space. It feels like big pockets of cotton, I guess.
For me, I didn't really mind. I mean, a lot of people had problems with how much his characters think about the meaning of things, and I really didn't mind that. I actually quite enjoyed it. That's how I tend to think, and I think it adds a lot of weight to what's going on. My problems are more like the middle half drags because nothing really happens too much. You feel like you kind of lost the plot. The back half has a problem where he keeps slowing down when you want to see what the next plot, like, you know, a certain thing is going to happen and it keeps not happening. And so I feel like if this was like a leaner book, I think this is like 580 pages, somebody said. It's pretty normal, but like if this was cut down and leaned down, I think it would be really great. Also, I have a thing where, like, I'm trying to find a horror book that scares me, and unfortunately, I'm just not sure it's going to ever happen. Before this, the video hasn't come out, but I read with Lindbergh, the discount Katie, as I call her.
First of all, that is demeaning to me and Lindbergh both. Say she's the IKEA version of Katie, then.
And we had read From Below by Darcy Coates, which is a more contemporary horror novel. And that book wasn't good, even though I'd heard a lot of good things about it. And one of the problems is just the horror in it was really ineffective. And so going from that to this, I really appreciated the quality of the writing difference, but neither book really scared me. Because the thing is that with with a movie, the horror is pretty unmediated. You're looking at a thing on screen with your eyes that's scary,
It's
right?
immediate. It's more immediate, so you're more in the moment, so you can be absorbed by it. I think film as a medium for horror is much better, but continue.
Yeah, and video games also same thing. You're looking at a
Yeah.
thing that's scary. You're interacting with a thing that's awful. I can't play video games at all. I'm just immediately like, this is uncomfortable and painful. Why am I
You mean
doing this?
horror? You mean like horror video games like Silent
Hmm?
Hill? Yeah, I could never get past Silent Hill because I can only watch people play horror games. I can never play them except for the wood one. Dead no. The one where it's a top
Deadwood.
down. Is
I
it called
think.
Deadwood?
I think so. I got
Dark
stuck.
something?
I got stuck on Outlast at the first scare. I was like, no, I don't want. Or Dead Space 2. Also, I was like, no, I'm uncomfortable. I don't want to do this. But anyway, it's the horror is unmediated. You're looking at a thing that's scary on screen. Um, in a book, what you're looking at are words on a page. And
Yeah.
so it is mediated by your imagination and by the author. And so I think the strength of books when it comes to horror is being in the character's thoughts. And this book did that a lot more than From Below did. But it's still like I wasn't scared. I actually wasn't even really unsettled. I liked this book, but mostly I was just the emotion I was left with was depression.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. It's because surprisingly, and I can't wait to get into this. I didn't think I would be so emotionally connected to the characters, and I wound up becoming very emotionally connected to the characters, which I think is a very big success. Especially the wife. I really didn't like her at first, but anyway, I'm not going to get off on that horse. But what I was going to say is, I agree with William. I think it's very hard. And that's why I almost feel like I've gone on a giant hiatus of writing because all I want to write is horror. And I don't know how to make it like maybe I don't have to make it scary. Maybe just being like dismal or showing a side of humanity or life is good enough. But I think one of the few, like, again, this is pure memory. I remember being terrified. Okay, bear with me. I remember being terrified by Bunnicula when I was a child. Because there was like a few writing scenes that really hit me. But honestly, the last time I was even scared in a movie, like truly, deeply unsettled, was during The Alchemist Cookbook, which is a really low budget film. And there's this one scene that's just, oh, it's so good. It's so gosh darn good. But I can't like. If I think about the last time I got scared reading a book, I don't know if I can think of a time I was ever scared besides like Crispin and Bunnicula when I was a child because I was like terrified.
I've been creeped out by some creepypastas, like
Oh, yes.
like not terrified, but like
The cave one is so good.
there's one for me that's like the guy gets stuck in time and it's awful. But
Oh,
yeah, I haven't really been scared in a long time. I mean, part of it is, I used to not be able to watch horror movies, and then I got on anti-anxiety drugs, and like
yeah.
now I'm fine with them. I enjoy them a lot. But before we go more into it, what's the premise of Pet Sematary, Katie?
As the title states, we have a family that moves into a new home. Very horror movie-esque, by the way. And not just any home, a big, beautiful, like, I don't know if it's Victorian style, but just a big, beautiful home. And they move into this beautiful house, and this house is both near a very busy road, a highway stretch, as well as a pet cemetery that local children tend and bury their pets in. And as the book progresses, we start to realize that this pet cemetery isn't just any pet cemetery. There is an extension to it, and this extension is a magical, and not like unicorns and rainbows magical, more like flesh-eating, yellow eyes creeping in the fog, manipulative force that lives somewhere beyond their home, past the pet cemetery, into these Native American lands, which. Can I just laugh a little about the Native American stuff for a hot second?
I don't think you should laugh at Native Americans. No, Katie.
No, you know what I mean. Like it's the cliche thing of like, oh, Native American magic, which again, black magic, white science, that happens in this book too, which is like a whole study in horror films. But that being said, so it begins with a simple cat dying, but then It exacerbates itself. And it ends on a very abrupt note, I feel. And it feels kind of like, I get it's horrific, but it's also just kind of feels like weirdly disconnected.
I felt like it's a good idea, but it didn't hit the horror. And I don't know how much necessarily King was going for horror over disturbing. Again, this is my first King book I've read, and so I'm a little bit unsure. I wasn't quite sure what he wanted. The other thing to mention is our main character is called Lewis. He is a father of two. He's married to his wife Rachel. They have a son Ellie and Gage.
Wait.
Gage, who's very young.
Rephrase. They have a daughter named Ellie, not a son. You said
they
son.
have a daughter named Ellie, and they have a son called Gage, who's just like a 1 or 2 year old.
Yeah, Gage is 2 years old, and throughout the novel, he grows up enough to be talkative, and he starts like having like a little personality. Ellie already has a personality, and is kind of like one of those, 6-year-olds that are like, they're starting kindergarten and that kind of thing.
The other main character is Judd, who they meet when they get there. And I should state right off the bat, the narrator for this book is Michael C. Hall of Dexter fame. He's so excellent. He's so excellent.
What do you mean by Dexter fame?
He was the main character in Dexter.
That guy? The Dexter guy?
Mm-hmm.
Stop it! No way! I was not picturing that at all. Also, yes, I fully recommend, while reading the book, because I read and listened to this book. I listened to the first half, which was so amazing. Please listen to this book. It is so well acted. Like, there's so much emotion in the voice. It makes sense that he's an actor then. But the second half I had to read because I read faster than I can listen to an audiobook. And in order to make the, the deadline, I needed to read it. And I will say, while the reading was very enjoyable, honestly, the audiobook kind of really sold an extra layer. God, I'm starting to like side for audiobooks, which I don't like. It's because I want to be a reader, but
audiobooks are the narrator of audiobooks always brings skill even when the author doesn't. That doesn't apply here. But Michael C. Hall is really good at it, and he voices his voice for the neighbor, Joe.
Oh, so
who's
good.
Like an old man who Lewis develops a really close friendship with, is great. He has an accent that's referred to as a Yankee accent. This also takes place in 1983. And he pronounces Rudd.
The Rudd. Oh my God, but the pronunciation is so on point. He must have done so much research or known it from somewhere. But yeah, like, I liked what Fern mentions, by the way. Fern is somebody in the chat, and Fern is mentioning something about Stephen King himself. I will also say, and I would like to premise this whole book with, the foreword of the book gave me chills almost more than the book itself in some ways. The foreword of the book is like a poem. Like, not literally, but it's so musical and beautiful. Like, there's a weird entrancing quality to his writing that I just wasn't really quite expecting. There's an intimacy in it that like kind of touches you someplace not all authors can touch. And that forward alone had me hooked. Oh my goodness. And I don't usually care about the background of a book or the author because I try to come from the death of the author perspective.
Yeah, I didn't listen to the foreword because I was like, let me just see what I feel of the book.
You 100% should. I don't usually care at all. And it never adds anything for me for the most part. This one did. And I don't know if it's the success in his style of writing. I'm sure it is. But I also think it's because of the personal nature of it, because it literally aligns with the story almost exactly, except for the supernatural element. And that's kind of, it's like the uncanny, which is a whole study, of course, in horror film as well. But the uncanny is when something looks a lot like the real world, but it's not. It's a little different. It's a little askew. So it's like a mimic. And that's how I felt like this book was. I felt like it was a mimic of his life that like he experienced, and that's scary.
King puts a lot of himself in his prose, and you can tell there's a specificity to, like, for example, how he writes children that shows like, hey, He really knows what kids are
Yeah.
about and what it's like being a parent. And that comes through the prose. He also just is so fucking good with details. There's a lot. The Lewis is a doctor, and like, there's a lot of small details that you're like, oh, holy shit, he must have like talked to a doctor and like shadowed him or some shit. Like, it's crazy the amount of like small details in
It
there.
just it feels natural too. It's not like some of the books we've read where it's insert and it's like this is the and it feels like weirdly technical, like you read it off an article and you're trying to insert it into the story to make it sound realistic. No, this feels integrated into the personality of the character itself, and it feels so good.
That's what I found I really liked, especially in the beginning of this book. But actually, before we do the plot summary, Katie, do we have a Patreon?
We have a Patreon. This Patreon has several tiers. I still can't remember them. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
I will do them. So first tier, you get to support the channel and feel good about supporting independent journalism. You get access to our Discord, which is full of cool, sexy people. I'm basically never on there. I check like one channel and that's it. But there's a lot of cool other sexy people,
including myself, the lurker, who literally reads every thread almost every day. I set aside 20 minutes of my day specifically to read in the morning and evening like a newspaper. And I look through just to check in on everyone, make sure there's nothing that screams like I'm in mental danger / physical danger. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's good. And every now and again I post something and that's about it.
But lots of cool other sexy people, not as ruggedly handsome as me, but what are you going to do? Our second tier is our book club tier. This is a book club live stream. This was voted on by our patrons as a book that they wanted us to read. 1/4 of all of our books are picked by our patrons. Sometimes the quality has varied, but it's always a very interesting time. There's a lot of very respectful discussion, even in disagreement on the book club channels on our Discord.
And you can rely on just about every single person just being a very passionate reader and writer. We have quite a number of writers in our audience, and everybody just respects and loves the form of storytelling. And so at the end of the day, no matter what, like for the most part, 95, I might even dare to range at 99% of all of our interactions are very good and very like,
yeah, I mean, if you're looking for analysis and not just vibes and who you want to be your fiction boyfriend, then this is a very good space for it. One of the reasons I don't actually have to be there on a lot is because there's no real community management. Everybody just gets along very well.
That's how good it is.
We also do a second book club live stream where I pick the book. Next month, we're reading House of Leaves because this is my horror arc, and people have talked about how that's a really good book. And then on our third level, we have the Parasocial Darlings tier. And that one is one where me and Katie break down a scene and we look at the micro ways that it works or doesn't work. So, for example, we might do a stretch of King dialogue for the next one because King is really good with creating a specificity to his writing that feels like it's a real person talking. Some people have complained in this book that everybody talks very woodenly. I don't agree with that.
Oh God, I don't see that.
Yeah, I don't agree with that, and I'm going to prove them wrong in the live stream or the critique stream. Yeah.
I'm very happy that we're going to do that. I was going to actually ask that we do that because at some point, so I'd like to ask now, at some point during this stream, I would like to request that I read aloud some of my favorite lines in at least the latter half because I didn't start reading the physical and being able to take notes like that, like just copy and pasting, the text. There are a few things that I would like to just, like maybe 3 or 4 quotes I'd really like to rephrase, say.
Oh, that would be awesome. I kind of wanted to go through and look for some, but I listened to the audiobook, which is why this podcast doesn't do more quotes and stuff like that. But yeah, that's where we look at that. So and you can catch that. We do it about once a month. And then also I have now a Song of Ice and Fire channel because I'm constantly talking about that. I do a reread with a few friends. We're going through the first book right now. And then once a month, I also pretty much do what I do on the critique streams, but kind of more about A Song of Ice and Fire with Lindbergh, who some of you may have seen on this channel. And so, yeah, that's the plug. That's all there is. Let's begin with the plot. This book starts with Lewis driving to his new home out in the countryside, essentially. And this home is they're buying it, and it's right next to a big highway, and it lives in it, and it's right next to Judd, who is the older man that I mentioned before, who also has a wife with really bad arthritis. And right from the beginning, again, there is a great sense that King understands how a family functions. Like, so Ellie, the daughter, is like never precocious. It's always like, oh shit, is she gonna she gonna have a tantrum here? How's she gonna react to this? She says things that like a child would say quite a lot. And you really get the sense that like, oh, this is a family. They're here. They can't find the key to their house, and there's the normal frustrations involved.
And you know what's really fascinating is that it's funny, it opens up with Lewis's irritation with his family. Like, he's very irritated because he has been driving for several days to get to this location. You know, it's like a family road trip where you have small children, which suck. You know, his daughter Ellie is kind of being bratty, basically. His son is just, you know, colicky because he's a baby. And his wife is kind of being a little bitchy. And at first I'm like, oh God, this sounds like I'm not gonna like this family. Oh God. But then it's so situational. He builds that situation because of Lewis's mindset, and it blooms open to make you love the family as it goes, which is so fascinating.
Again, there's such a deft hand with like, oh, this is how an actual family is. It's kind of, and then Lewis, for example, fantasizes for a second about leaving it all behind and going to Disneyland, which will become key. We'll talk more about Lewis's psychology as the book goes on, because Lewis has King is threading in certain themes of masculinity in this book very kind of subtly, which I think he does in a lot of his books. And this urge of Lewis's to kind of like just run away will come into play later. Some people really disliked Lewis, and to those people I say boo.
Who?
I don't know. People on our Discord were like, "Oh, Lewis is such a piece of shit."
Oh my God,
and,
are you serious?
I'm sorry, I
Lewis
mock
is
their voices, but
Lewis is so empathetic. He's so lovely. I started feeling so that I think so. As a side note, because this just occurred to me, so I'm going to almost write a note on it too. I think that's one of the problems with the latter half of the book, is that we actually become disconnected with Lewis and we lose him, which is part of the horror, I suppose. But we lose him from our, like, we can no longer reach him as readers, and it's really cool. I really like Lewis a ton. He feels like a normal human being.
Yeah, and the thing is, you know, he does have faults in a way that's very human. You know, wanting Lindbergh says Lewis the 9-aught just shoving his family out of the car, racing down to Florida to work at Disneyland is so relatable.
Yes.
And yeah, there's like little things like that throughout. And so like one of the examples of like a thought that's very specific and gives you a sense of Lewis, but maybe isn't the most charitable, is Judd is like, he gives him a key to get in, and he's like, if you want to come over and have, I'm going to do this voice the whole time. If you want to come over and have some brewskis, that's not what he says. You know, later, that's fine. And Lewis is like, oh God, I'm going to have to talk to him about his, like, old people always have health problems. Everyone always wants to talk to a doctor about their health problems, and his wife has arthritis. And he's like, okay, maybe I'll come over later. And it's like, it's a very uncharitable thought, but that I'm sure is an actual annoyance some doctors have. And it's a little bit petty in the way that we're all a little bit petty. And I think people aren't quite used to reading as realistically flawed characters as Lewis, and those flaws make them think he's a bad person, when like, so some people like complained about how like he doesn't treat his wife and child very well, but like he is actually an extraordinarily good parent in terms of how he talks to Ellie about different things. And also, I think we'll talk more about his relationship with Rachel, because some people had problems with the gender dynamics of it, and I don't necessarily agree, but I also kind of think King is explicitly weaving those into the story to a certain extent. But you know, he's just a guy. He's trying to do his best. Things get out of hand, and you know, under extraordinary circumstances, people become a little unhinged. And I liked his descent into becoming more unhinged over time.
Especially from, he literally goes from white science, literally, he is a doctor, he is Caucasian, to black magic, Native Americans. It's not, it's just anybody of color,
That is the
honestly.
stereotypical depiction implied in
Yes.
horror. You are not saying specifically. Yeah,
Yeah.
I have to save your white honky ass from racist.
Yeah. That being said, though, also, Will had mentioned how there are these certain lines that get repeated later on. That's something I actually, hopefully, I can pipe in on because it's so specific in some places. But one of the fascinating concepts is, like, for example, the Disneyland thing. It does come up again 2 times for specific purposes. And there's this really cool thing that he does that I feel like nobody does, almost. Like, I feel like it doesn't happen a lot because this is was saturated with it, which, might be a bad thing, might be a good thing, but I liked it, I guess. Where he brings up these concepts and then they float back to the surface later on, but through filtered through a different lens, and it becomes very dreary. Like, it was all like, maybe it depends, negative or positive, whatever it was, it doesn't matter. But regardless, it gets worse, and it's artistic. Then it expands on that concept as it goes, and you see it filtered through different ideas, and it's so interesting how that happens to serve the plot in those moments.
The kind of reoccurring lines as oh, I'm forgetting what the word is, but like there's a specific word
What
for it that I'm blanking on that I wish I could remember if this was a
what's the
video essay.
definition?
But anyway, it's like certain lines will serve as a shorthand for certain emotions. So, for example, there's like some lyrics from the Ramones, which apparently ruined it for some people, but I've never listened to the Ramones, so I don't care. Where it's like, "Hey ho, let's go," and that becomes like a certain,
An illusion?
shibboleth. Not a shibboleth. No, there's a specific word where it becomes a word that anyway, we'll just call it a shorthand for now, but there are certain words like that. And George R. R. Martin also does that, and he's one of my favorite authors, and I find that those work better for me, but these I thought were still pretty effective.
I can't read Stephen King. He has a habit to add random horrifying things that often feel like he added them for the sake of shock rather than the story. Like in the ending of It. It's happened twice.
That's not really in this book. I think that may be King is a very messy writer, I would say, and also he was like stoned out of his mind when he was writing a bunch of books.
That's what my husband said.
Yeah, and also he's just a very eclectic writer, and then he got in an accident, which also kind of really
Oh,
changed his writing style fundamentally.
wait a second. What accident is this? I know nothing about him.
Oh, okay, so he wrote The Gunslinger, and then at some point after that, he got hit by a truck, and that was
Holy
real
crap!
bad. And he like almost died, and then people have said after that his writing style kind of changed.
In a good way, bad way, or just different?
I think people don't love it, but I think I don't know. I'm kind of speaking off of stuff I learned secondhand like 10 years
Yeah.
ago. If you
Yeah.
guys know in the comments, please let me know.
Yeah.
But I could imagine that sometimes he does that. He very much is a sort of a maximalist in certain ways. Yeah, and so to continue with the plot,
Yes.
Lewis moves in with his family, and the first like third of this book has stuff happening, but it's also very focused on the family. And again, that really worked for me. When it's focused on his family and his friendship with Judd, which is actually how the book starts, talking about how Judd is the man who should have been his father, and Lewis really doesn't have a father he ever thinks about. I'm assuming he just didn't have one growing up. And it's such a nice relationship, and it's such a nice bonding between men that you don't normally see in fiction. There's a part where like they both cry together over someone dying, and I was like, oh, that's such a nice, like, as a man, that was just nice to read, that expression of emotion and sort of intimacy of a relationship.
It's really sweet. And it honestly, I mean, not to feed into that, but that is the romance of this book, right? It's because it's, I'll bring this back up again later, hopefully, but it's like, he's passing the torch almost to Lewis, that being Judd. And you can't help but love their relationship because it's very honest and it's very just friendly. And there is no ulterior motives throughout almost the whole thing, except
Stuff does happen that complicates it a little bit. But so that's kind of the thing. Judd's wife has really bad arthritis. And the other thing that really hangs over the first part of the book is the concept of death and aging and how depressing that kind of is. Judd and his wife, like, her arthritis means she's probably got like another 7 to 8 years, they say.
And he specifically says that, like, for example, they might not be the most productive 7 or 8 years, but she will be able to get through them.
Yeah, and it'll be painful, but they'll do it, and it's like, okay. And then also the other big thing that brings in death is that his wife Rachel had some kind of a thing where her sister died when she was young, and we'll learn more about it later. And so she has a very hair trigger emotional response to death and thoughts of death. And what happens is that at the back of their house, there are, like, in the woods, some, but technically still on their property, there is a pet cemetery where all the local people go to bury their pets, and like kids and stuff like that.
It's not immediately in their backyard. There's this little nice nature path, and the nature path probably goes up about like half a mile to a mile or something to that effect up into the woods. And it's from there that there's like a little area, and it's weirdly tended to, or at least from Rachel's perspective, she feels it's very strange that children take the time to like mow the lawn there or like weed or whatever. So the pet cemetery itself is built in like strange circles too, so it's like very Stonehenge-y.
Judd takes them up there on a hike just to be like, wow, and it kind of upsets Rachel a little bit. Lewis can kind of see it in her eyes, and then there's also a barrier, which is a bunch of like dead branches in like a wall, but that like leads beyond, and it's like, oh, you can't go up there without breaking an ankle because all the branches will shift. But you're like, oh, this is interesting. I'm sure this will come into play later.
Especially when sorry, I died. Lewis. Especially when Lewis at one point goes up there by himself a few days after. So just as reference, Judd shows them this path because it's a nice little path, and he thinks that Ellie will like the path because it's in the nature and she can take advantage of it. It's a private little nature trail. Why wouldn't you? And so, but he warns her, don't go off the path, stay there and everything. And at one point, Lewis goes back up there just to like, go for a walk and also just take a look at it. It's because like there's something about it that calls to him, which will become an issue as it goes on. But when he looks at all that dead wood, and he starts to climb it, he's at one point, the foreshadowing kind of gives to you, he thought he saw a small trail on the other side, but didn't think much of it. And then it continues on.
Oh, I wonder what that's about. Oh. And then the other thing to note is there's a recurring element where Ellie has a cat called Churchill. And earlier, back at their old house, Rachel had been like, hey, you should get him like castrated. I forget what the term is for animals. Fixed, which
is a weird term.
Yeah, I was going to say the implication that there's something wrong with the animal and now they're fixed. And he kind of put it off because he was like, I like Churchill. He's like a cool cat who like has a lot of fire in him, and I like that. And that'll come into play in a moment. And so later on, Ellie comes to Lewis and is like, hey, what she starts talking about death and Churchill because they went to the pet cemetery, and Lewis has a very like matured conversation with her where he explains.
It's such a great father response,
and it's very appropriate to her emotional maturity at that time, where he explains to her, and it's really funny because he's like, well, he's gonna die, that's just how God made things, and she's like, well, God can get his own stupid cat. Churchill is my cat. It's like, that's so funny.
Yes, true. It is. And apparently King, in the forward you learn this, that's what his daughter said when the cat died. And so it's a beautiful scene just in the forward. He comes across his daughter jumping on the packing bubbles, and she's like angry, so she's popping them and she's jumping on them, and she's like, why can't God get his own cat? This cat is mine. And so he literally drew that in like verbatim into the story, and it's such a great line.
Ellie is a little bit funny, but not precocious funny. She's just funny in like the normal way that kids kind of are sometimes when they say things. weird or have different priorities. And so, yeah, again, I think he was just like a very good papa here. But we figure out, he's very atheist. He grew up that, that kind of way. And but Rachel is listening, his wife, to this conversation, and she has a real bad reaction to it, and that she doesn't think he should have told Ellie, and that, it's just not something they talk about. And he's like, we talked to her about like sex like last year and told her all about it. If we're gonna tell her how people come into the world, we should tell them how she goes out. I never forgive my mother for not telling her, for not telling me how sex worked, and like impregnation works, not actual like the mechanics of sex.
And during the scene, you actually, at least I personally as a reader, hated Rachel. I hated Rachel in this moment. I was very angry. I understood it was like a PTSD reaction because, her sister Zelda, when she was young, had like, it wasn't cerebral palsy, but it was like some degenerative disorder or something. And she, became mean, which I love that perspective. Like, not that, unfortunately the sick and the continued living sick that are going to inevitably pass become hateful and angry towards their caretakers, which I've personally experienced. And it's just like, yeah, like they are not saints despite the pain they are going through. And but during this time, Rachel is like trying to make a cake, and so there's like these really cool focuses on the flour and how it like falls over and the sounds, and so you really feel like you're in the kitchen with them. And she's just like, no, that's inappropriate. You're being inappropriate. This is absolutely not appropriate for our child. And we should never talk about it, basically. And I say I hated Rachel because I hate may be a strong word, but in that moment, I very much didn't know if I could like her as a character as we went forward. And I was honestly shocked with how much she grew as a person and like was a good wife, like, and a good partner. I guess I should say really at the heart of it, a good partner.
I didn't, because I tend to be much easier on female characters than everyone else. I've noticed I have a lot of empathy for characters, and B, like, I'm like, oh, you gotta take care of her. But, King has a line where Lewis is saying that, like, in his relationship, he'd found that sometimes, you just hit a blank wall. It seemed like the two of you were together, and then all of a sudden you'll find a fault line that you just can't, through logic, figure out. It's just different. And that to me, like an incomprehensible gap. And like that to me rung so true, because I've found that both in a parental sense and in a partner sense at times, where it's like, you think like, oh, what are we ever going to fight about? And then all of a sudden there's just a weird thing where they don't think a certain thing, or they do think a certain way. And it's almost like an arbitrary, like, you just have to accept how this is the world. And so, like, that's one of the ways that, like, King writes certain things into how his characters think that feels very philosophical in a folksy way, and just rings very true as a small interaction.
Yes, and also, he brings up this thing that I myself have wondered over ever since, because like prior to my husband being my partner, I didn't really have partners. I had dates and stuff like that, but I never got personal with people except for one other person. And I didn't have the no, actually. But that being said, though, I didn't get the chance because I think I was too young and there were too many other things happening for me to like consider these things. But when I started dating my husband and I moved in with him, and there was this one night, and he seemed so sad all the time lately. And I thought, what's wrong? And so we were sitting in bed and I said, are you sad and depressed because of just life? Or are you sad and depressed because you don't like our relationship? And he said, I don't know. And up until that point, I thought we were locked. And that like really shattered my honeymoon phase. And it brought to me the reality that you can never truly rely on another person. You can't. You cannot. And that's what Lewis thinks to himself, is that the concept of a conjoined pair, a husband and wife, as a single unit and a single force against everything else, and intertwined souls, that is not real. And that there's never a promise of being able to completely understand the person you love despite being with them for a very long time, perhaps. And it's always going to be two separate souls, and that there is never a true connection of reliance. And that rings so true for me. So when Will says philosophical, that is exactly, I would agree in that moment.
Yeah. And I think, I think this scene is really important. It's actually a really pivotal scene because it helps the themes. It will become important in terms of how Lewis, because you're right, in terms of how he views reliance and how much he can trust Rachel or can't to bear certain burdens. Lewis already has a bit of like a martyr thing where he feels like he needs to take on responsibilities and deal with his own shit. And in this scene, he realized like this is a really nasty argument, and what happens is because of this, a lot of his actions later make sense in that he's trying to avoid a fight with her. So he starts there's a few things he keeps from her that in a relationship you probably shouldn't. But like, he doesn't want to get in a fight. And that's such a human thing where you just like, you don't want to get into a fight. She's not going to handle this emotionally very well. And so I think Lewis has a lot of respect for Rachel. And I think he very much views her as a partner as much as he can. In the same way that like, he doesn't quite depend on Judd as much as he could because Lewis is a bit of a loner in how he deals and how he processes his responsibilities.
Which is a great portrayal of a single child. If your mother is which his mother was single, raised him single child, you're gonna have to rely on yourself. And it is blatantly stated many times. He was not wealthy. He was from the, which I chuckled over. He was from the wrong side of the tracks from Rachel's father's perspective. I'm like, oh, okay, sure. Maybe in like Ohio. But anyway, that being said though, that's what great characterization for like a logical conclusion to an upbringing.
Yeah, and essentially you can kind of read between the lines that he was probably parentalized at kind of a young age, and he also has a chip on his shoulder because he is from the wrong side of the tracks. And so after this, and we'll talk about that more when we come to Rachel's family. And then the other really big thing, unless I'm forgetting something that happens in this first third, is that he's at the hospital that he works at. And a man comes in, Pascal, who like just has like a hole in his head. He got hit by a car, I think.
And hit a tree. He got hit by a car and then his head came into collision with a tree, which shattered it. And he has a huge gouge in basically his face/head. And it's just like all just like, it's meat. It's meat and bone.
It's real gross. He knows he's going to die, but he still kind of has to try and save him. As he's dying, the man says some cryptic shit to him about the pet cemetery. It's such a good scene, because it feels so realistic with how everyone's kind of milling about and not sure what's going on. And the horror of it from Lewis's perspective, this is one of the strongest scenes, I think, in the entire book, and that I was really with him there.
Yes, yeah. I would say this is the best scene in the whole book. It's because, first of all, like, it's already horrific that there is a young man who has all his life ahead of him coming in and he's gonna 100% die. Then it's horrific, coupled with that they're in a university doctor's office or whatever, clinic. And so they don't have the facilities to even attempt to help him, even though they certainly couldn't. And then there's nothing prior to this moment has been supernatural. And out of the blue, this guy says very intimate things, like forewarning to, and it's like, what is connection? What, and I would like to bring this up. I want to mention it now, so you remind me, hopefully, but it almost seems like there's two forces coming towards Lewis. There is a malevolent one that dominates the circumstances of the book, and then there's a protective one, and I don't know why there's a protective one. Where is that coming from? It seems to like possess Pascal in that moment and tell him that. I don't understand why there is a protective force as well as a malevolent. So maybe we can discuss that at some point.
I think
but anyway,
it's kind of part of the greater King universe, almost a cinematic universe in a way. Like this book at the beginning has a mention of Cujo. That's kind of
really?
Yeah, he mentions like, oh, this dog somewhere else got rabies because they didn't give it a shot or something like that. And so like in King's cinematic universe, there's like kind of like dreamers. It's kind of like The Shining. Like Ellie has a bit of The Shining to her that we'll see later.
Is that what that is?
Well, because she can kind of read dreams, type of she can see it. So there's
I
kind
thought
of
that
like
was just. Oh, that's fascinating.
yeah, I think like I don't know how ironclad the rules are, but I kind of think that's what it is. I originally thought this character was going to be the ghost of this character, which is what'll happen in a minute, was going to be bad, but it's actually like kind of a good force. And so and there's a moment here where after the man dies and everybody comes in, there's chaos milling about, and Lewis like just kind of takes control, and he takes control because he can't really stand the chaos. And it's like he said with the first order he commanded, and all of a sudden like everything kind of, he felt better and like everything was gonna be okay. And this is a very human thing where just taking any kind of action makes you feel more in control of a situation, regardless of how actually useful it is or isn't. But it also speaks to Lewis's psychology in that he needs to feel like he's doing something, and he needs to feel like he has agency in a moment. And I wish this was played with more in his decisions later in the book.
I know.
Because we're getting a very good sketch of Lewis as like a good guy, but he does have this kind of weakness with like, oh, I don't like being out of control, and I don't like things being unresponsible. And
maybe that's why the ending feels so abrupt. Because there is no tug of war within himself for this choice. Like he's very much besotted, or maybe I should say the force at work is like a siren calling him. And it's interesting because that's kind of the same that's happening here, maybe. Well, I mean, it's the positive force versus the negative force, so I guess that's different. But I think that's maybe part of it, is that we didn't get any scenes where he actively really felt like he was fighting with it, I guess. I don't know. He just seemed drowning for the rest of it. And that is the horror of it, I guess, is losing control, because losing control is horrific. And as I'm on this, I would like to read Lindbergh's note, because that's really fascinating. Yeah, my theory is that the whole family has a touch of the shine, and that's why the Wendigo builds strength by their proximity, and why they are all susceptible to its influence. That'd be fascinating.
I do think that's kind of interesting. I'll talk more about how I kind of wish the horror had been a little less defined. Part of it is that this book is from 1983, and so like that's like 40 years, or 40 years almost exactly at this point.
Oh God, don't say that.
And so like I'm wondering how the first time that not Frankenstein, I think it was the Phantom of the Opera, was shown in like black and white, people fainted because of his prosthetics were so scary, and you see it now and it's very silly looking. And so like I kind of wonder how much of this was effective at the time versus now, where it's like I know all the horror tropes. I'm not really, books are a conversation with the reader, and it's kind of like I've had this conversation a lot.
It's an issue with the internet too. It's because there's like snuff films and stuff like that now. So we are over what's the word? Exposed. We are overexposed
and desensitized.
That's where I'm getting at. To things of gore. Like I remember the first time, as a side note, I remember the first time I came across something on Reddit. Expectable, I suppose. I remember the first time, and I'm not going to describe it because it is so horrific. But I came across a real death on film, and it wasn't like anything crazy, like a torture. It was just an accidental death, and the nature of that accident and how it could happen to anyone, and the death itself in HD almost, it burned itself into my memory for so long. I think it haunted me. And even my husband was like, please don't go back on Reddit for a long time. You are like having nightmares about this and stuff. And I was like, yeah, like that was horrific. I should have never watched that. I didn't even know what it was until it was happening. But it haunted me. But now it's like nothing. Like, so it's an issue with exposure.
The first time you see a boob, you're like, oh my God. And then by now you're like,
yeah, the same thing.
This is a very affecting scene. I thought it was really good. I really liked it. Again, it has to do with like the presence of death and the arbitrariness of it and the lack of control you have over it. And then we get a kind of weird scene that I both thought was initially I thought was very weird and well written, and then later I was like, I mean, it kind of makes sense. It's a little odd because basically he gets back home and his wife like immediately meets him at the door, all sexy, and they like have very passionate sex. And the thing about it is like this is probably the best written sex scene we've read on this channel up to this point because we've read so many bad ones. There's a good mix of leaving things up to implication and the reader's mind, and then also specific details that I think is more effective than either a cut to black or a one-to-one description of slot A and or tab A and slot B. But it's tonally very weird because it seems like his wife got real horny from someone dying
Yes,
initially.
it does. But I will agree with Will. What a wonderfully intimate sex scene. And even there's a few other moments too where just sex is mentioned casually as like it happened, and there's like two sentences that is like this, and it gives you intimacy too. Like, like I think there's a moment where he's like he slid into her or something like that. But it's not cheesy or gross. It feels very poignant and important in that moment.
It feels like a little bit overly intimate at times because you're like literally watching two other people have sex in the way that like real sex is kind of not, all flowers and roses. And so like there's an extent to which it's like, okay, this is like a little bit, and I think that a little bit of grossness, intimacy, normalness kind of weirds people out and they don't really know how to deal with that. And so they just call it gross. But there is a lived inness to that sex that I think kind of works once you process it.
It's because it makes you feel like a purveyor, or maybe that's an observer. It makes you feel like a stalker.
Voyeur.
There we go. Thank you. It makes you feel like a voyeur. And it's not written to entice. It's written for the purpose of, I'm assuming it's, so if I were to say that I understand the purpose of the scene to provide something, I think it's for the purpose of showing Rachel trying to help him, and also the intimacy and the understanding of this relationship, because she knows he has to have something good in his life, something to take his mind off. And like, of course, sex is a full, like, hopefully, if it's successful, it is a very like full you are enraptured with it, And so to distract him, she's trying to distract him. But I will agree with Will. It is I did also find it incredibly strange that she, like, out of all the scenes that we are introduced to their sex life, it's after somebody dies and he's like traumatized.
It speaks to their personal relationship in that this may not have been how most people react, but this is how they reacted. And like, it's not inherently, but like, I literally thought there was going to be some kind of reveal after the chapter started that like, oh, this is like weeks later or something like that. But like, no. And so like, it does feel weird in that way. And so the next thing that happens after the sex scene that's major is that he has a dream of the man who died leading him into the forest and towards the pet cemetery. And when they get there, the man who like his brain is gone is like, don't go farther than this, like, bad shit will happen. And he thinks it's a dream, and then when he wakes up he finds that his feet are all dirty and he's got like thistles and branches places, and so he's like, oh shit. And I didn't really feel like this was effective. I felt like this was a little bit of like cliched, and like it didn't feel like it was really building the creeping horror. It felt a little bit too the thing is, I really like my magic systems in fantasy and then also my horror to be really kind of like plausibly deniable and very kind of soft magic is the way they usually read it. And this is like a little bit too much of like, oh, there's a haunting. It's not a haunting, but like, you know what I mean? Like it feels like just a little bit too much in my opinion.
Well, I would say just the positive, like, it's strange because I like the foreboding nature of the warnings that the positive force provides to Lewis, but at the same time, it does it plays into that, I suppose, that clichéness, I suppose. What I did like, however, of this is that Lewis at first is like believing it. He's like, oh God, I saw a ghost and I walked out and all these things. But I love the way Stephen King writes the rationalization, because it does feel very natural, where he's just like, oh, I sleptwalk, duh. And I'm like, oh yeah, that feels real. And as a side note, I would also, Lindbergh, you're like hitting huge, what's baseball term? Phew. You're hitting it out of the
Sports
park.
ball.
Back to back for me, because this is such a lovely thing to be able to explore as a thesis. It's also kind of, she says, it's also kind of a nod to the gender. In regards to the sex that they have after the traumatic event, she says, it's also a kind of nod to the gender binary and the old nuclear household constellation. Men are expected to treasure sex almost more highly than anything, so it's among the most valuable things that she can give to him.
Hot.
Fascinating, because I would agree, because that like was rattling in the back of my mind as we were talking about it, but I couldn't put words to that kind of concept.
I think if that was the case, I would have liked to see Lewis kind of more shaken by what had happened, but still kind of trying to engage in it. I think that kind of would have been an interesting commentary.
I would agree.
On like how men view these things, where they're not really allowed to not like or sex. And so it would have been one of these things where he started out more traumatized. I think actually just in general, I would have appreciated a little bit more trauma going into that. Goes Pascal, leaves him. And he also does some like investigating of like, oh, what happened to Pascal? Is his body still there? Is it not? And this kicks off the second third of the book, which I found to be kind of boring. I'll be honest, because at this point you're like, okay, when's the cat gonna die? Because what happened is that he decided to castrate the cat so the cat wouldn't wander around and get hit by the...
He neutered the cat, even though in the book he says spayed, and that's for females.
Some people have been like, oh, he didn't, the reason he didn't spay him before this was because, it's his masculinity that's embodied there, that he feels he's lost. That's what people say, and I disagree. Maybe he just isn't a fan of mutilation.
So first of all, that does come up a little bit, but he's also like, he says he's heard that they lose their natural cattiness, basically, and he's like, I don't want church to lose the kind of feline grace and the kind of like individuality he has. I don't want him to lose his personality. And can I just say, for the past week and a half that I've been reading / listening to this book, I've given my cat 10 times more attention than I've ever given him recently, because I know this might ring strange to some people, but the cat and the event of the cat alone was more horrifying than almost anything else in the horrificness, besides the whole what we'll get to in a moment.
I didn't find it as horrific because I kept expecting the cat to die because it's called Pet Sematary. So
yes,
I was like, this pet is marked for death. I'm not necessarily going to get that. But yeah, and so he had castrated and mutilated his cat as a sign that he doesn't want, death to intrude on Ellie. And it was supposed to be a sign, and that's the thing that got him and his wife Rachel out of the argument. So the next thing that happens is that Judd calls him over. And what does Judd find? Well, this is while they're off in, the family's off in Baltimore.
One time I lost a hamster. And I know it's not the same as a cat, but the hamster died because of the cold outside, because it had a disease, or disease might not be the right term, but whatever it had, infection, disease, whatever, it was attracting gnats in the house. And my stepmother was like, no, I don't want it in the house, put it outside. And even as a young kid, I was like 7, I was like, no, it's not going to get better outside. But I couldn't do anything as a kid. And when I found that hamster dead and the heaviness of the body, it scared me. And that was well described in this scene.
So I had a similar experience where we used to have ferrets, and ferrets die. They all have some kind of weird cancer. And I could tell that it was dying and my whole family was gone. So I took it out of its cage and held it as it died.
Oh,
and
God.
There is a moment where it suddenly becomes literally dead weight. They're all of a sudden
heavy.
It's limp. It's heavy and it's limp and it's not.
And it feels like it's full of sand. It feels like it's full of sand or rocks.
And it's a moment that you really feel it. And so, yeah, I kind of felt that as well. in this scene. Really quickly, Lindbergh says it's very naturalist romanization of the intact organism, and it's hard not to read some ideas about masculinity into Lewis's reluctance to neuter church. So Lindbergh has a whole theory about how like gender plays into this that I don't necessarily like agree with fully, though I think the undertones certainly are accurate. And I would like her to write an entire essay on it, actually, because I think it's really fascinating, even if I don't necessarily entirely agree. So Lindbergh, I'm putting you on to writing this in your final thoughts, and that will be a Patreon perk for people who join the Discord.
I mean, look, gender dysphoria especially, but gender in general in horror is so fascinating. Like look, gender studies, I'm sure is very fascinating. I don't want to study it personally, but when it comes to horror, I want to study it. It's so cool. But anyway, yeah, so Judd calls him, and he goes over and he's like, certainly it's not church. He even like rattles the food to see if he comes running. And that's exactly what I did when I lost my pet too, when he went missing. And I was like, oh, like, where are you? Where are you? And they didn't come in that sinking horror. It was such a good buildup. And he goes across the road and he even almost gets hit by a car, a truck, in fact, which is, again, both, this has already happened and it's foreshadowing even more. And except for Judd's like, oh, wait a second. And then he crosses the road. And this is such a good, it almost feels like, specifically, even Lewis himself feels detached. And there's like this weird hazy dreamlike moment where he is like, this is not my cat. This is not my cat. I'm not going to have to deal with this, especially after the explosive reaction of his wife and his daughter. And they are away for right now for Thanksgiving. And they've traveled to her in-laws, which are going to be a whole thing because, by the way, as a side note, her father is a gigantic dick. And he tried to buy Lewis off early in their relationship to say, leave my daughter alone. Here's a check. How much do you want? And Lewis is disgusted by this, which I love. But he looks at the cat and it's his. And they get he brought over a trash bag, not just any and even the detail. He's like, we have the white trash bags and we have the green ones for outside. And I grabbed the green one because it's like a thicker trash bag,
And that's the kind of thing, by the way, that like King is so good at in his writing is just these little specificities that really make you like feel like, okay, this is a world that's lived in. This is a world where like people actually kind of like exist in these ways, in the ways that you would kind of think about this. A few comments really quickly. Lindbergh says, I detest this shameless attempt to make me do actual work onto my untethered ravenings. Sorry, you're lucky I don't make you do this as a video. Zira says, my dog died in my arms from old age last year, and the weight changes drawing and still feel it in my mind. It is a moment where like it imprints itself on you.
There's something about like just not to like invoke that thing, but I think it's worth talking about. The dead certainly way heavier than the living.
Oh, that is such a good line, both thematically and in terms of the actual thing. I should also mention, because somebody mentioned, I'm not traumatized by that. It more than anything, because I tend to intellectualize my feelings, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And that suddenly, like, I wasn't that close with the ferret. I just wanted her not to be alone when she died, even though I don't think she really noticed in the end.
I also want to, on a final note, say, I too, in comparison, I was quite traumatized by that because I felt the guilt of putting the hamster out. So there was like a guilt factor. But anyway, so yes, so he highlights the weight in particular of the cat and how it like has stuck to the grass of the ground because it's freezing temperatures. It's like 20 degrees. And so you got brighter. The of bringing the body up and putting it in the bag. And it's so fast. Okay, so this is my favorite. Actually, you know what? No, I have to say this is my favorite part. So at this point, Judd said, like, there's like this tug of war you can tell going on in Judd's mind as he's talking. Even you, as the reader, know this is happening, and that's so good. And Judd finally relents, and he's like, you know what? Ellie's gonna miss this cat why don't I help you out? Because prior to this, Norma, Judd's wife, had had a heart attack. And it just so happened that Lewis had been nearby and he helped her a lot, and it possibly saved her life, most likely saved her life. And so Judd feels this responsibility, but it's not that. It's not that. And even Lewis knows it. Lewis sees in his eye and in like the little twitch of his lip and all these like, there's something almost different about Judd. There's like a shine in his eye, that a gleam, I think is said, that's a little odd and alien from the normal person he knows. And it feels very malevolent, almost as if it's controlling Judd in that moment. And I think that is terrifying, to lose control of oneself. And so Judd thinks he's doing something helpful and repaying that deed, but in truth, he's cursing him. Judd's like, all right. And he comes back out with a pickaxe and a shovel. And he's like, follow me.
Really quickly, E.N. Hand had a good comment. I think the weight thing is partially a break from the logical, rational part of reality, because no, death does not suddenly create more mass. That's not how physics works. I mean, I agree with that, and I'll speak to that in a moment, but there is something to suddenly things not having a reaction and being kind of floppy in a way that almost no other object is. We get iguanas stuck in the fence, and 2 of them have died from doing this because they're just iguanas are so stupid. They're so stupid. But anyway, the first time I had to pull it out, like I did not want to touch it. Like there was just that instinctual like death is a taboo. You don't want to touch it. And eventually, and I just did because I had to. I'm the man of the house, ladies.
Oh.
It's weird because the weight again, it's like it's not moving. It's just a weight you pull out, and that itself is just very different sensationally from almost any other thing that you have touched. And the taboo of it being like a living thing, I think, though, does speak to what you're saying in terms of it being different. Now, because the muscles are not engaged, the animal's not supporting any of its weight, which is part of where the trick comes from. Yeah, exactly. That's part of where it's coming from.
Yeah, exactly. And as a fun fact, I used to catch iguanas by jumping on top of them and wrestling their tail down with the heel of my foot and capturing them. Anyway.
In case you wanted to know which trailer park Katie grew up in, or more evidence of her white trash upbringing.
He follows Judd to the pet cemetery. And Judd says, no, we're going farther than this. And the reason I'm lingering on details here is because I really like this moment. And Judd's like, no, you can get over the deadwood. Just believe that you can and go forward. Don't look down. And prior to this, Lewis had a nightmare, with Pascal. Lewis, during his nightmare, had seen the deadwood, which is white bark. It's like pure white bark, as bones rattling. And it was, when you think of bones rattling, you're like, okay, spooky, scary skeletons. And you're like, that's not really that scary. But the way he describes it actually becomes quite strange. And anyway, so Lewis follows him over, and he's like, oh my gosh, yeah, that was easy. And that is quite foreboding. They then walk about, Judd says it's 3 miles. So they walk through the forest. And as he walks through the forest, Judd's like, if you hear strange sounds, that's just the loon birds in the distance. And if you see any St. Elmo's fire, which are like basically will-o-wisps. So anyway, as they go, they finally get to a bog, which I love. I love bogs. I'm thinking Lord of the Rings bog too during this time. And so they're going through the bog, and he's like, once again, just like the deadwood, believe you know where you're stepping is correct and just keep going. And it works. And there's this fog that's very thick, like opaque, and it's all the way up to his waist, which is terrifying. And then suddenly they hear a cackling, like a witch laughter. And it's a cackling, and it goes on for a hot second. And then Judd's like, yeah, that's just the loons. And they keep walking. And then they hear a huge lumbering sound, like a huge creature is in somewhere. And even Judd looks back and looks terrified. And he's like, come on, let's keep going. So they keep going. And they go up this 45 staircase thing. There's 45 steps in the stone staircase up this mountain. And they get to the top of the mountain. He buries the cat, right? Because this is Native American burial ground, or as the book says, Indian ground.
Do we want to say anything about the Native American stuff in here? I didn't think it was super egregious, but also I'm imagining it's still like the stereotype of like the dead Indian ground, and there's no actual like Indian or excuse me Native American people in the book to give their perspective on it, which I could see. At the same time, he seems to just want it. A lot more of the history. There's mentions of Native Americans without Native Americans in the book, which can give the impression that Native Americans are no longer around, which I know bothers Native Americans. So it's not egregious. It's not like, the evil Native Americans and their evil spirits, but I could still see how, to someone who's Native American, it's not the best representation, I think would be the best way to put it.
That's why I mentioned the black magic, white science thing. It's because that's always a taboo. It's because it's, again, just like a certain level of mystical racism. You know what I mean? But anyway, so I to agree with you, that's a whole other conversation, and that would require so much more analysis. So while that being stated, what Will says, agreed, but let's continue. So he buries the cat, and Judd's like, yeah, you got to do it yourself. All right, we're done. Let's go. And they go back, and guess what? The next day, the cat comes back.
But the cat comes back different. It's kind of slow and sluggish and smells of the grave, and it like there's a certain amount of instinctual horror that Lewis has with the cat, and I kind of liked how this had played out, because then he goes and confronts Judd and is like, dude, what the fuck was that? And Judd is like, I shouldn't have brought you there, but once you've been there, it takes a hold of you. And so this is an aspect throughout the book that I didn't love, which is that the ground has some, and the creature there has some kind of malevolent force that creeps outward. And I just didn't like that. To me, it felt like I just liked it a lot more as like a weird thing in the woods versus a malevolent force per se.
Well, it's very like Exorcist style later on too. Like the malevolent force takes hold of something later on, but and when it speaks, you're like, oh, this is like the demon in the Exorcist saying like, I'll fuck your mother in hell or something like that, or whatever. Your mother is whatever in hell. Like it's so overtly gross and grotesque that it's like, oh, come on, that's a little hammy. That's not mystical. That's just like a jerk of a dude, a jerk of a demon.
I mean, from what I understand, King has talked before about the way that he likes to write evil is as pathetic, because evil is pathetic and comes from weakness, which I can respect, but it also makes it narratively somewhat unsatisfying and scary, as we'll discuss later. But I did I think Church through this next portion should have been more creepy, because I think that would have misled the reader into thinking like, oh, this is now the monster in this story. But it isn't. It mostly just hangs around and is like, oh, it's kind of dumb.
Actually, I was a little surprised because I'd only ever seen the movies of this. And so in the movies, the cat's kind of highlighted a little bit more, at least from memory. And I just like kind of... I like the concept of what actually happens, which we'll get to. But there's something to be said for just leaving it at the cat. And that would have been creepy in and of itself, honestly. And like its manipulation of the family. But that doesn't really happen. And the cat's described as like kind of more aggressive. He as the story progresses, which we haven't gotten to, so I'm jumping ahead a little, he actually kills things and doesn't eat it, which is different. And it's more murderous, more like gleeful in the torture of the death of a bird or whatever, a mouse. And I'm just like, there's one part where I think he did it good, and there's like one part where the cat is literally hiding in a closet, and he's like, oh, that's so weird. Why is the cat watching me tuck my son in from the closet? Like, and he feels like the cat was like eavesdropping, like it was watching him during a private moment. And I wish there was almost more of that.
I do as well, in that like I feel like cat as a horror monster is sort of ridiculous on its face, but actually could be very creepy we can't kill this thing, but it keeps doing weird shit around the house, and I can't get rid of it because my daughter wants it. And one of the things is that Judd says that like, actually this is a thing people do every once in a while, but the animals that come back are always a little weird. There was his dog died and came back, but was never quite the same. And there was a bull who came back and actually like gored its owner, but that was the only really dangerous one, and that'll come into play later. And he, again, he apologizes. He's like, the thing took hold of me, I had to do this, but it was a mistake. Which is like I felt was a little bullshitty, and that like it's a little bit like, well, the malevolent force made me do a thing, and it's
I think it would have been much more powerful if Judd didn't expand on that. If it just kept at the concept that Lewis saw a strange gleam almost, because Judd changes character in those moments. He does not feel like the same character. He does feel like a puppet on strings. And I think the problem is that it feels like he says the thing, like he hints at the thing, and then he boldly states it. He's like, yeah, that happened. Listen, you guys are being like, that happened. Listen, like I'm telling you directly. And so it feels more heavy-handed when that happens, which takes away from the mysticism.
yeah, and that is kind of the problem that like I wish he would. King throughout the book kind of tells you a lot of things that I wish he hadn't told you, because I was creeped out when Church came back, and then I was like, oh, okay, this happens a lot. This is not that big a deal. like whatever, and I would have liked it if Judd had even been like, look, I did this thing, but I can't tell you any more about it because if I tell you more about it, it'll just try to forget that this even happened and be glad your cat is.
I mean,
is
honestly,
here.
the way Judd has been thus far, why wouldn't he? Like, why he's always mysterious and he always kind of leaves things hanging. So why wouldn't he just be like, you have your cat back, be thankful for that and move on? And I feel like that's more in character too. Well, maybe not. Like it's arguable that, yeah, you might be honest after you feel guilty about something. But I feel like it would have felt more horrific if Judd himself felt so like in the background, he felt truly embarrassed and shameful and guiltful. But like the force like takes the worst of you, like the grimy nature of you. And so he doesn't admit that fault to Lewis. Instead, he buries it. Not to be cliche, but he buries it and he instead covers it up. And he's like, just be pleased that your cat is back. Your daughter doesn't have to deal with the death of that cat now. Move on. Instead of telling him any of that, because then the fun of Lewis figuring that out himself, like truly the mechanics of it, I think might have been more fun.
And the thing is, partly this is a little bit of I think a personal taste thing, but like I find the less the thing is explained, the better. I talked about this again in my my video with Lindbergh on From Below, but like horror stories have this fundamental tension between the fact that on the one hand they're always structured like a mystery, like you don't understand the monster, so you learn more about it throughout the movie. But the problem is that the horror becomes less horrifying the more you know about it.
Yes.
And these two structures are always kind of in tension with each other and often have problems. And so for me, it's like I didn't want to know more about this thing. I just find it creepy and weird, and I prefer the implication. Chris M. also had a thing which says, personal headcanon, Church was trying to kill Lewis when he woke up with him purring on top of his chest. And then Lindbergh said, I think Church is kind of leeching off Lewis and drawing power from him. I think Lewis especially because he has the shine, but he's the kind of person to try to repress it, which makes him vulnerable. So this plays into one of the other themes, which is that Lewis will be told by Judd that like there are certain things that like essentially as the man of the family he can't show. Like he has a thing where he repeats that like the soil of a man's heart is stony and he keeps what is his. And throughout the book after this, Lewis will think of anything having to do with Pet Sematary and bringing back Church and the rest of it as like this is a thing he has to handle and pay. I forget how he I forget how he phrases it. I'm trying to think how he phrases it and I can't remember, but it's like he calls it like his things or something like that. His payment. And so that again plays into Lewis as like a character who feels like, and again, I think this is a little bit of a commentary on masculinity in that he feels like he has to take control of things even when he isn't really able to or can't quite. This is something I actually experience as a male every once in a while. And it happened more when I was younger. I'm more comfortable with it now. But like every once in a while, people will turn to you like you know what you're doing. And I'm like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing at all, guys. Like, why do you think that like you can default to me to like figure things out? I'm just some dude.
I think that is a role thing. I do that with my husband too. But it's also like, I think it might also depend on personality.
Yeah, I mean, I think people sometimes think I'm a much more calm than I am because because I actually am very calm in stressful situations unless it's about me. If it's about me, I become unstressful, but other people, I'm just like very able to like, well, this is bad for you, but like, whatever. Like, I don't know.
Kristen Lindbergh, yeah, it says he bought it, which I love that phrase. I actually was going to bring that up at one point. That's one
Hmm.
of my quotes about it, so I won't say that one. But it's about, and it says, what a man buys, he owns, and what is yours always comes back to you. There's so few instances where such a poignant phrase it happens in the efficiency of one sentence, so that's very satisfying to read it. And then also, uh, oh no, yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
That's the one. And so like I think this is a little bit of a gender commentary on that he can't, you know, in another book I could see his growth being to learn that he can lean on Rachel and like, you know, he doesn't need to protect her. He doesn't need to do this. And it's actually better for her if he leans on her more and he doesn't have to be alone. But this is a book where people like in a lot of horror movies or stories, the person devolves. They don't evolve in terms of and as time goes on, he takes more and more decisions without Rachel's consent or not even consent, but I mean consent also, but also just without like talking to her or he feels separate from her and what he has to do, which I do think is interesting. And I do think that's in there a little bit. And I do, you know,
There's a horrific nature to that as well, which is nice in some ways. Like it's frustrating. It's because it feeds into the horror aspect of it, but not necessarily in the best way. But like it is going along with the theme that he brought up that I like, you know, kind of brought up earlier, which was the fact that everybody is always alone and that they're never truly a
yes.
pair. And so this is kind of feeding into that. It's because he is alone and he's not relying on her. And so that's not a good thing. That's a sad, lonely, depressing thing, which I think King wanted in this thing. So I get why he did it. But yeah, I guess there's a certain level of shallowness, I guess, or unexplored.
I think it doesn't quite go far enough. Like I don't think this book quite goes unhinged enough in Lewis's point of view towards the end.
I know.
This is another thing where I know I didn't say this in From Below, but it was something I thought about because all the characters in that book are too reasonable and nice. And I think horror often has characters who are ugly.
Yes.
In some
The ugly
way
side of
because
humanity is horrifying more so than almost anything else.
And it also feels like, okay, this character is not wish fulfillment. Nothing is happening by author fiat. The guardrails are off. People are ugly, and that makes the world feel more real. It can
Yeah.
also be kind of depressing in the way that, or at least disturbing in the way that people can be. And then, so the middle portion, the second third of this book, I didn't like. I found it very boring. The first third, I really enjoyed the tension that was building and the character dynamics, and I was like, okay, we're getting somewhere with this. We're learning new things, like the fight between Rachel and Lewis. Like we're learning a lot about what's going on. And in this third, like it's just you're just like, okay,
Yeah, it waffles.
when is a person gonna die? Because he asked Judd, what happens when you bury a person, and Judd's like, let's not talk about it.
Well, also, I wish he didn't ask that question. I wish it didn't come up. I wish it was inferred because you automatically are like, oh, what happens if you bury a Like, I feel like that's an automatic assumption by the reader. So to bring it up, I feel like is a little, again, heavy handed.
Mm-hmm.
But during this time, also, one of the things I personally felt was not what I wanted, I guess. I mean, I think he did it successfully the way he did it, but I didn't want it that way.
The next thing that really big happens is that Judd's wife dies, and so there's a funeral about that. And like, I don't know. I don't really think Judd needed a wife, and I don't think her dying really adds a ton. It doesn't really motivate any changes later, and thematically, we know death is not good. Earlier than this, or maybe after this, I don't remember. Rachel gives the backstory about her sister Zelda, who got lost in a secondary world and had to be saved by like this little like fairy guy who like was a little metrosexual with his like outfit. But people really liked him. I'm describing Link from Legend of Zelda because her name is Zelda.
I knew
It's
you were
not a
doing
good
something.
joke, but it is a joke. Her sister died from a wasting illness having to do with her back that made her very mean towards the end, and cruel towards Rachel. And Rachel, has a complex about that because she thought because she was there when Zelda died, and Zelda died in a very ugly way, being a very ugly person, and that really scarred Rachel, and she thought for a while that she was going to have it bent back as like a curse that Zelda put upon her. And it really makes you realize, like, okay, this is what Zelda is, or not what Zelda, this is what Rachel is going through, and all of a sudden her aversion to death makes a lot more sense. And I thought that was good, but like for the most part, this book,
It took up a lot of page space, is what you're saying. Yeah. I feel like
the one thing I will say is that the way this the very last part of this second third is written in almost like a little bit of an omniscient view at certain points. So
Yes.
the writing says, and on the last truly happy day he would have, Lewis went to like the park with his son, and they had fun together, and they flew a kite, and he tucked him in, for the last time before Gage died. And that's like how the second part of the story ends. And I liked that. I was like, this is so creepy and weird.
I wish it had just said that this was the last happy day he had and didn't say why. And then it ended on him tucking his kid into bed and not knowing that Gage was going to die. So this is where I was getting at before. Gage's death happens past tense in this novel.
Yes.
What happens, which is the
right
choice,
to the funeral,
and then you go backwards, and he tells you a little bit, and it's almost like you're living through his PTSD of it, and I think it's very well portrayed. But that being said, I think this slows something down about the novel. I don't know. I think the horror of it would have come more so if it was active voice. And it was happening presently, where he tried, because then you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know that Gage is going to die until he starts running towards the street. Because maybe Ellie's going to die. Maybe Rachel's going to die. You don't know who's going to die. I wish it was more mysterious. And then when he starts running, you're like, oh, this little kid's going to die. And then it builds up to that thing.
I think you're right, perhaps in terms of the horror, but in terms of the sadness, I think building it up as something that happened afterward really helps you understand the shock and disconnection that Lewis feels at this point. So I think you're right from like a cinematic, I could see in the movie adaptions, which I haven't watched, I could see them probably putting this as a scene, but in terms of the book, you feel Lewis after the fact. And that's the next thing that happens is there's a funeral, and like it's so fucking depressing. Like I literally like finished the part with the funeral and stopped for the day, and like for the rest of the day I had to not think about it because my brain kept going back to it and being depressed, and I was like, no, you can't do that. We got to think about other things. And he really makes you feel it. It's so well written in terms of all the small details of like, and the ways that Lewis is kind of just disassociating from what's going on.
And I think a lot of that probably comes from his own son/daughter. I think it's son. Again, this is a what if scenario, he says at the beginning of the book. He's like, what if my son died in this situation? Because he lived in a house by a road with a pet cemetery, just like that. And he, his kid was running out and he grabbed him or whatever. He saved him. And he's like, but what if I hadn't? And so I feel like that's why so much of this is so genuine. It's because he explored that feeling himself truly in action. And it's very, 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 very successful. The horrific nature of just the situation of his death. At one point, he goes into a little bit of detail, but not really, because he's disassociating and kind of reliving it, but not really, is when he's like, yeah, the kid was hit and he was flung, and he kept screaming his kid's name and running, and first there was a shoe, then there was a hat, then there was something else, and then another shoe, and finally the body. And his son's body is gutted, mutilated meat. It is meat on the road.
It's crazy. And we'll see another thing with Gage's body that is pretty horrific. And Rachel is basically completely non-functional. Lewis is barely functioning. It's very depressing. Like it's really well written, but it's so depressing. And it's weird because you also are like, okay, so when is he going to try to raise him? Like that's the next
Yeah.
big thing we know is going to happen.
It takes too long. It takes too long. It goes
Oh my
into a
God.
little too much detail. It tells you everything from Lewis being like, oh, Rachel, Ellie, go to your grandparents' house, which we kind of skipped over him and his father-in-law's stuff, which is honestly horrific in itself, and maybe we'll come back to that. But just like as a quick like mull over of what the issue is, you get him planning, then enacting, saying, wife, daughter, go abroad, go away, so I can do this thing and experiment with it and see if it works. And then he's like, then I went to the store and a motel and bought the stuff and climbed the fence.
First he talks to Judd, and Judd is like, actually, they did try to bring somebody back once, and like, it didn't go great. He was basically a possessed person and super weird and rude, and he knew secrets that he shouldn't know.
Super weird and rude.
He was just like,
again, the Exorcist style, like your mother sucks. Oh, that's what it is. Your mother sucks cock in hell,
which is like kind of sex negative. Like maybe like she like, you know what I mean? Hell is of our own making, you know what I mean? And he's like, I'm not gonna do it. And the thing is, he spends a lot of time thinking about why this is a terrible decision and why he shouldn't do this. And then he also weighs like, okay, well, if it goes wrong, I can just kill him again. That's what they did to the bull. The thing about it is it's too logical. Like, it's very logical how he builds himself into this terrible idea. But by making it logical, all of a sudden, it's not unhinged enough. I would have liked it if it was more unhinged. Honestly, what I would have liked is if at this point, and for the last third, we'd only been in Judd's point of view, because then I think it would have made it feel creepier.
I literally made a note on my document that has all the quotes I want to share, which is only like 4. But that being said, I literally say, I like the POV switch towards the end. And the reason I was reasoning that is that because you get a little bit of Rachel's, a little bit of Judd's, and that takes you away from Lewis, so that way it's more mysterious and horrific because you don't know what's happening with him a little less, but you still jump back to him. And I think I really, now that you've mentioned it, I think I almost would have preferred purely Judd's perspective, because then it still would have lent the mysterious nature of the couple across the street, but also we could have really benefited from the guilt and the years, because it's constantly said that Judd looks like a younger version, like he's like 80 or 70 or whatever, 80 I think, and but he looks 20 years younger and he's always spry and stuff, and I would have really liked for him to suddenly age rapidly or something, I don't care. But like from his perspective, and then create the mysterious tone from him trying to solve the issue. And I don't know, like, I'll wait on this, continue.
And the thing is, again, him being so logical about it, to me, like, it made him less unhinged, and it also made it take too long. There's like a good half hour of this book, which is him step by step getting things and going into the graveyard and digging up the grave of his son. And the problem is that this is the down ramp of the story, right? This is the point where everything should be speeding up. And this took ever. And the thing is, the details don't add up in a way where it becomes more horrific or you actually get something from it. Like a lot of it's like, oh, I shouldn't go over this fence, but I should go over that fence. It's not like the details, like I pull, you know, like he unburies his son and his son's head is gone, and then he realizes it's not gone. It's just black mold because it's been like a week. And like that is a horrific detail.
Yes.
And like the detail of picking up the body and what that feels like. But like, I don't really care if it's in the trunk or in the front seat of the car. I don't care about like this or that thing. And so like it just took a long time without adding a lot, I felt like.
You guys in the chat saying that the weird unhinged logic made it, or the attempt at logic for this made it more unhinged and scary. Sure, I mean, that's fine, but it just takes too long. I think it expands too much into the details of certain things. And then weirdly enough, the quotes about the song and stuff like that start to like really take over. And I'm like, I don't need this because it feels intrusive now. It doesn't feel like it's an integrated part of the theme. It feels more like, oh, this fits this particular moment, so I'm going to put it in. But it like feels like, I don't know, it feels hammy, I guess.
There's a book I read called Killing Mr. Watson back in college, and after Mr. Watson dies, they have to go bury his corpse in the Florida Key swamp. I forget where. But anyway, it's really gross, and the body keeps not like helping them, basically. Like it falls out, it gets stuck here. You realize how like hard it is to move such a heavy body. And that to me was like thematically like, yeah, killing this guy is gross, and the difficulty of killing him is the grossness, and that makes it bad. But this did not really do that for me because I don't, Thea says the details actually made it more tense because he doesn't want to get caught. The thing for me is that we know he's not going to get caught. We know, like, the thing is, as soon as Gage dies, we know the next thing that's going to be interesting is what happens when Gage comes back.
There's not enough doubt. There's not enough doubt to where you're hanging on the edge of your seat, I guess. So maybe just reframed maybe the same exact events, but reframed might have been more successful.
I just think I just think it needs to be shorter because again, I know he's not going to get caught. Like the only thing that would be interesting if he got caught and killed someone, and he's not going to do that. So it's just like okay, and then right. Judd was trying to stay awake to stop him. Oh, okay. So there's a really long interlude where we go into Rachel's point of view and find out that Ellie's been having dreams about Pascal. And then as soon as she gets to Baltimore, Rachel is like, all right, I got to go back. And so she gets on a plane to go back, and she drives after a while, and like she feels like something's stopping her, and her car gets sabotaged and stops working. She's like, there's a force keeping me away. All of this is unnecessary, and it doesn't add anything. We don't understand Rachel better at the end of it. We don't understand any of the themes better of it. You can literally just say, she got back. Like, that's all you really need to know about this. And so I just felt like this was just, again, the problem is that the next interesting thing is going to be what happens when Gage comes back, and it actually doesn't matter that Rachel comes, like, she gets back. That's the important part. It's not interesting.
Yeah, it feels a little empty, doesn't it?
It feels empty. I mean, I guess, again, if you're going the malevolent forces route, it's better because it's like, okay, this kind of shows the malevolent force a little bit, but she also could have just, like, said it. Again, if we're thinking of this as, like, from Judd's point of view and he's on the phone with her every once in a while, she could have just said it and it would have been the same.
Oh, yeah. Like, if we were just from... Again, that's what I was thinking, though, as I said it. I'm like, man, him talking to Rachel on the phone would have been... like effective. I almost feel like more effective because you wouldn't have expected her calling him because she seemingly has no idea, but a little bit like she's nervous and she feels like something bad's happening and that her husband's not telling the whole truth, but she doesn't know like of the supernatural elements or anything. And so all of that happening behind the scenes, I feel like is a little bit more thematic or theatrical, I guess. And also wait, there was something else I wanted to say. Shoot, what was it? Also, like, I don't know how I feel about this, but when Lewis makes his way over with his son's body and he's walking back to that little mountainscape with the flat top, he comes across the cackling again, and I was expecting that too. I'm like, oh, I wonder what's gonna happen now that Judd's not here. And he goes through the swamp and stuff, and he feels a 60-foot lumbering creature somewhere out there, and he sees I thought the face thing was dumb as hell.
I didn't feel like it needed to be a monster called a Wendigo. Like, I kind of just, again, I thought this creepy, inexplicable burial ground that spits back the dead, I thought was more interesting than like, oh, there's something in the woods. Like, I don't know, like it just didn't hit for me.
I'm fine with the big lumbering creature because that feels very ominous, but I wish like the face thing didn't
face
happen.
no, that no, the lumbering thing in the distance is interesting, but the like, okay, you see a face, cool,
and
dude.
It's not just any face, it's like a zombie-esque face with a maggot hanging out and stuff, and I'm like, all right, come on, Halloween Horror Nights, Universal Studios, let's calm ourselves down.
That's kind of the thing. It's kind of like when you know, in a creepy movie or something, you figure out that it's ghosts. I'm like, oh, it's just ghosts. Like, we know about ghosts as much as we know about zombies, as much as we know about dogs. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just this is such a stock monster that I don't feel it's like super interesting. But anyway, he buries Gage and then he goes home and falls asleep. And then we cut back to Judd's point of view, and we find that Church and Gage are now in cahoots and have come towards him, and they are basically going to torture him to death with a scalpel.
Again, this is the mother sucks in hell thing, like from Exorcist. It just feels a little heavy-handed because Gage comes back as a toddler, grabs the which is in a way horrifying, grabs the scalpel from his father's medical bag, and then goes over to Judd's house and taunts him, saying, actually, wait, hold on a second. I think I have, is there a quote here? Do I have it? No, I guess not. Oh, no, yes, here it is. I thought actually this was quite effective. Let me just quote it real quick.
Yeah.
"Hello, Judd," Gage piped in a babyish but perfectly understandable voice. "I've come to send your rotten, stinking soul straight to hell. You fucked with me once. Did you think I wouldn't come back sooner or later and fuck with you?" Again, heavy-handed, but I like the balance and the back and forth of the "you fucked with me once. Did you not think I would come back and fuck with you?" And I kind of liked that identity of the creature in that moment because it felt very like, it felt personal. It felt like a personal affront, and that kind of relationship with the creature with Judd felt very like battle-esque, and I felt like that was very thematic for what was happening and how Judd felt the guilt and everything, but it didn't come to a head in a way where I felt satisfied with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, like, I felt like, okay, I felt Judd being kind of horrified by this reaction, but I didn't feel it, and the only time I actually really felt creeped out in this book was when Gage is first going into the house, and like all he can hear is like Judd can hear is like the footsteps and kind of like, you know, just like this weird, it's not supposed to be alive, but it isn't. And then when it talks and is like just bitchy, I was like, okay, this is like a little creepy, but not super creepy. I don't.
Yes.
And again, I think King is sort of trying to. There is a messy ugliness to the way that King thinks of horror, and you know, and again, he thinks of villains as actually being kind of fundamentally weak, and I think this plays into those themes, but by virtue of that, it's not scary, and so you're not scared really.
Taya also mentions that we didn't mention Timmy. We're gonna glance over it, but basically we learn. Wait, Timmy's the person who was brought back, right?
It may also be a reference to The Shining, which has
Oh.
a guy called Timmy in it, I think.
I don't know. But anyway, okay, yeah. So there, like this had happened before, and it was, and honestly, that scene was creepy.
Oh, I didn't like that scene because Judd just
Really?
tells the story after Gage dies, and you're like, I want to get to the part where Gage comes back.
Oh, I see.
And it's long, and you're like. And also, I would have found it much more plausible if if Lewis didn't know that and just thought bringing Judd back was going to make him sluggish like Church. He didn't realize he was going to come back as like an actual demon.
Yes, that is my problem with that. Thank you for putting voice to that. Because that makes it a little creepy, because then his logical meanderings in his mind could be like, yeah, I mean, he might be like a little weird, and like, because at one point, Lewis thinks back on when Gage might have had cranial issues and he thought he was going to be mentally handicapped. And he thought, and then he had asked Rachel at some point, he was like, what if Gage had been mentally handicapped? Would you have still loved him? And she's like, of course. And he was like, would you have sent him to like a in-care home? And she's like, no, I think if we had the money, I would have preferred to have him because I love him. Mm-hmm. And I think that would have been interesting, because then that logically he would have been like, oh, it's going to still be my son. He just might not be that smart. Like, because at one point he even says beforehand, wow, Gage might even be bright. It's because as he starts growing up, he starts showing more and more intelligence. And he's like, wow, my kid might be really smart. So to have that dichotomy between the potential and the lost potential, like, feels a little bit more visceral, I guess. I don't know.
And I think that would have kind of been an interesting mediation on, like, he would rather his kid be half there than not there at all, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay, so Gage kills Judd, and then Rachel gets there, and Gage kills her after saying like 2 lines of dialogue.
It felt very abrupt. I will admit, it felt very like abrupt, and I think that abruptness might have worked in a different, like, or I mean, I guess it still works. I'm not going to say Pet Sematary isn't a great novel, but like, I think it might have been even stronger if some of the stuff we've discussed happened, I guess.
Well, you want these scenes that have been built up to. You want to see how Gage interacts with his parents now that he's dead, and we never really get that. And like, that doesn't, you know, you want that emotional not climax per se, but that catharsis of like you're looking. The book has almost promised you that this thing will happen. Of like we're going to explore what happens when Gage comes back, and one of that the corollaries to that is how does he interact with his parents, and the answer is he's just kind of rude.
And also, like, not him. It's not him at all. I almost would have preferred, like, not this in particular, but let's say he was younger, right? Let's say he was like still breastfeeding or something, right? Like, which 2-year-olds still breastfeed sometimes. Not that I want this specific thing, but this is just an example of the scenario. Like, let's say he dies, right? Like, but then he gets brought back. Specifically, I kind of almost wanted Ellie and Rachel to be home when this happens, because it kind of feels like too sterile. It feels like it's too easy to wrap up, and instead of getting messier like I feel like it should have been. And so I thought the messiness would come from them being there and him bringing his son back and then everybody reacting to it. And I'm like, how are they going to get over this trauma if they all, like, including the grandparents, her Rachel's parents, being there and seeing the child? How are they going to deal with that concept? And I kind of wish that had happened. So then when Gage comes back, for example, let's just pretend in the world of breastfeeding, because this is the first my thing that came to mind. He bites the nipple and like, but really hard. And there's like a ton of blood, or even if he's not that young, a little older, but there's like a toddler event of some sort. But it's like off kilter, just like the cat.
So, Limbrick says, I like that he shouts, Mummy, runs into her arms, and the scalpel is hers. It's the ultimate deprivation of youthful innocence and human love turned against itself, because Rachel doesn't even stop to think, wait, you're dead, so you're a monster. No, she opens her arms to her baby. Yeah, I would have liked more of that. I would have liked more of simple child, simple child twisted into something else now, and instead he's just has the soul of Chucky. Yeah, I was gonna say in him now, and kind of it's just a different person. I would have liked if maybe, you know,
it was the same soul but warped. So it wasn't like a real cognizant adult. It wasn't adult enough to be like, you fucked with me once, so now I'm gonna fuck with you. Instead, it's just like weird. And Thea, by the way, I also thought that. I actually thought Ellie might be the one to die because I think it would have been interesting. I fully agree. I kind of wish Ellie died instead.
She is in the 2019 movie. She's the one that dies. Like, it seems like it's going to be Gage and then Ellie dies. Or something like, you know, he was vindictive about something that actually happened to him as a child versus just being possessed. Like, oh, you didn't give me that bottle one time or something. Like, something like that. That was a little bit creepier and off kilter, but he basically is just possessed. And so Lewis wakes up and realizes what has happened, because his father-in-law calls him and he's like, oh, he came back. Something must have happened. Judd's dead and my wife is dead. I know these things, even though I have not seen them.
You know what kind of frustrated me, though, is that he is serial killer-esque in this moment, where he's just like, where his father-in-law is like, did Rachel make it? Did she make it? Because she came to you overnight. And he's like, yeah, she's out for milk. And I'm like, that's not the response he would have had so far. I kind of feel like he would have freaked out and be like, what? Rachel came back? When? How?
I did kind of get it, because the thing is that Lewis has kind of been, you know, he mentions when he's first talking to Rachel after the wedding that there's some kind of like almost weird capering thing in him that allows him to lie and be like, he's kind of disassociating and through the stress taking on a different persona. And so for me, it kind of worked where it was like, oh, he just knows.
That's fair.
There's a very human frustration to him too when he's talking to his, you know, the fear. This trauma makes him kind of ugly in a very petty human way. And I kind of liked that. I
did too.
And so he gets 2 syringes and he kills Church, and then he kills Gage. And him and Gage don't really talk. Gage just says something rude, and then Lewis like hits him with the syringe and kills him.
Yeah, it was weirdly abrupt. For all of that effort, he just killed him, and that's the end. And I feel like if you're gonna have that malevolent force with that, like, not that you need to explain it, because again, horror explained is less horrific than horror unexplained, but I don't know, it felt anticlimactic, I guess.
It did, and I don't even think you need to explain it. I think just you can have creepy child interactions that are like creepy and sluggish, and I would have really liked to see the idea of like, you can't take back death, even if when you try to take back death, something very odd happens. You know, the living, this is the antithesis of living is this weird state. I just would have liked to see more of that explored. Because what happens then at that point is he like is like, maybe the problem was that I didn't put Gage in the burial ground fast enough. So he gathers up Rachel's body. And it's mentioned that like his mind broke when he killed Gage. He's just sobbing in the corner. And then the next part happens from the point of view of one of his doctor friends who comes back and sees him going into the pet cemetery, and he follows him. And Lewis is now entirely white hair. Lindbergh says, since I was so taken with the personal tragedy of Gage's death, I viscerally felt the horror of Lewis having to fight this thing wearing his son's face, and how killing him a second time was just too horrible to bear. I think the aftermath of killing Gage kind of works for that, but the actual interaction is so fast and over so quickly that it just I didn't feel it. I just didn't feel it. Like
I didn't either.
I can understand it, but I didn't feel it. And so yeah, he goes and buries Rachel in the plot, and the last line of the book is he's sitting in his home and he feels a cold, dead weight on his shoulder, and a voice in his ear whispers, "Darling." And like, you know, the implication is that Rachel is now back. I don't know. Conceptually, it was creepy. I didn't really find it creepy.
I didn't think it didn't end on chills for me. You know what? Potentially, not that it would have added that much, but another alternative route might have been like, I wish. So the darling thing is fine, I guess, but like, I mean, beyond the epilogue and the bigger things happening, I think it could have been sold to me more in this instance if Rachel had had a nickname for Lewis that was very personal, and it was a memory of theirs, like when they met or when they started dating or something. And then she says the same thing, which feels incredibly manipulative because we know it's not her saying it. So that I feel like might have struck a little harder as a small alteration, but otherwise I don't know. It was fine. Like, I thought it was good, but I didn't think it was great.
I think the other thing is there's a sort of an implication early on that like this thing, whatever it is, likes Gage because, or not likes Gage, likes Lewis because Lewis is the one it brought it back. And so like I almost would have liked that as an ending where it's like, now we're together almost, or like, you know, you were always my favorite or something like that, like something that played into the idea of this possessive demon.
I agree.
I think would have been kind of a cool thing. Earlier on, Lindbergh had said something about how like this kind of is very much exists in the King verse, where it's like this is an eldritch horror which has taken over, and I feel like that kind of limits it a little bit. In that I think it kind of limited his imagination, but then also I don't know. This could just be the kind of horror that King really likes and keeps coming back to, because he's not necessarily a very calculated writer. He's very much writing what's in his mind. And so overall, I know I've complained about this book a lot, but I really liked it.
Yeah, me too.
I'm a King stan now. I want to read more of his books. If you have any, by the way, leave them in the comments below. I only want the best, though. I don't
only
want,
the best, because there's too many.
And also some of his later books are just indulgent from what I understand. But like his good stuff, I would like to read more. I was very impressed with a lot of the writing in this book. I just think the pacing issues hurt it, and I think conceptually it could have been less explained.
Speaking of his writing style, is that okay if The Green Mile? God, that's such good. Anyway, can I just read? I have I think 3, but this is an example of his writing. His writing is so beautiful in some places. Like, it's so poignant and like really effective. One of them is, this is when he started losing his sanity. The voice of Tom Rush echoed dreamily in his head. "Oh, death, your hands are clammy. I feel them on my knees. You came and took my mother. Won't you come back after me?" Madness. Madness all around, close, hunting him. He walked the balance beam of rationality. He studied his plan. Like, that's so clean in how effective it is, in my opinion. There's another one. It seemed to me to have a quality of prophecy. He did not sleep for a long time, and before he did, the curved bone of the moon looked in the window at him.
He's very good with that kind of writing, and also kind of making it folksy in a way that's very normal and a little bit messy.
And then this is Christ. No, not Christ. These leavings were made in propagation of a much older god than the Christian one. People have called him different things at different times, but Rachel's sister gave him a perfectly good name, I think. Oz the Great and Terrible, god of dead things left in the ground, god of rotting flowers and drainage ditches, god of the mystery.
Oz the Great and Terrible was along with Rud, one of the main arc words of the book. Yeah, so some people are saying The Green Mile in the comments is very good. And The Shining. I honestly might pick those for a mid-month, not for next ones, because we already did House of Leaves, but maybe for one after. Yeah, join our Patreon, by the way, because you would both have gotten live streams here. As you see, we let people comment on screen because we are generous.
One last quote to finish the stream on. The ground mist began to swirl around him, first covering his shoes, then his shins, finally enclosing him in a glowing white capsule. It seemed to him the light was brighter, a pulsing effulgence, like the beat of some strange heart. He had never before felt so strongly the presence of nature as a kind of coalescing force, a real being, possibly sentient. The swamp was alive, but not with the sound of music. If asked to define either the sense of the nature of that aliveness, he would have been unable. He only knew that it was rich with possibility and textured with strength. Inside, Lewis felt very small and very mortal.
Yeah, it's so good. And again, that's what I really like is that there is the way that he kind of, Lewis, and I'm assuming that all the point of views do this in his books, thinks about the world as he's interacting with it in a greater, like, what does this kind of mean in terms of how I think about things, is very, like, low-key philosophical, and I feel like adds a really powerful emotional dimension to what's going on because it gets you thinking about these ideas.
Introspective.
Yeah. No, and so again, I've talked some shit, but I really liked this book. Thank you for joining us. Any last thoughts, Katie?
No, just please take some time if you like horror novels or even thrillers alone. Take some time. Read this book. It's worth it.
All right. Thank you for joining us, all of our parasocial darlings.
Goodbye!